I'm really happy today to present our first poet, and I hope I'm not going to mispronounce your name now that you've told me how to pronounce it. Joseph Bathanti, and he's a former poet laureate of North Carolina. He was poet laureate from 2012 to 2014, and he's a recipient of the 2016 North Carolina Award for Literature. He's the author of 10 books of poetry, including 13 Sunday After Pentecost, Louisiana State University Press, 2016. His books of fiction are East Liberty, Coventry, The High Heart, and The Life of the World to Come. His recent book of personal essays, Half of What I Say is Meaningless, I love the title, is the winner of the Will D. Campbell Award for Creative Nonfiction. Bathanti is a professor of creative writing at Appalachian State University in North Carolina and writer in residence in the University's Watauga Residential College. I'll also say about Joseph Bathanti is that I love the specificity of his work, the details he provides, which are particularly meaningful for me because we share a heritage. But I think they're also meaningful for anybody who's human, because he is willing to be honest, to be direct, to make poems that are beautifully shaped and beautifully formed and yet not lie in them. Let's welcome Joseph.
Hey, good afternoon. Yeah, what a thrill to be here. Thank you, Marie, so much. And, I also want to thank Susan Ballack, who's been so lovely months before I got here, and also Smita Desai. Everybody was just wonderful, getting me here, generous, kind, and that's what often matters most, and that's also what you remember often most. So I'm going to read from, I think there are 2 of my books out there, so I'm going to read for 25 minutes and then get Jill up here. So I'm going to read first from a book called Concertina, which is a book of prison poems. I grew up in Pittsburgh and ended up in North Carolina in 1976 as a VISTA volunteer assigned to the North Carolina Department of Correction. And I've been teaching poetry workshops in prisons for the past 42 years as a result. So this first poem is from my book Concertina, and it's called The Footlocker. And it has to do with the fact that when I was getting ready to split from Pittsburgh, I'd just gotten out of graduate school with a master's degree, for goodness sakes. I was the first person in my family to ever go to college. So my parents, especially my mother and all the women on the street, expected their sons to be one of 2 things, either a doctor or a lawyer. And there I not only graduated from college, but I got a master's degree and decided to go 500 miles away to work in a prison for $2,000 a year. And they were a tad befuddled by that decision. My mother, of course, would say, "You with all your education," as in it didn't teach you a blessed thing. The Footlocker. The day before I left Pittsburgh to work as a VISTA volunteer in the prisons of North Carolina, my father drove me in the family car in an enormous 2-door green Chrysler Newport downtown to the Army-Navy store on Liberty Avenue. He was set on buying me a Footlocker, something I had never dreamt of possessing, to pack everything I'd be taking. He and my mother were befuddled as to why I, having recently earned a master's degree, wished to spend my days among criminals 500 miles from home for $2,000 a year. They had little faith in my car, a beat-up '69 VW Bug with no reverse. My mother wept. My father said nothing. In my recollection, he has never attempted to dissuade me from anything, nor made public his desires, 2 things for which I can't begin to express my gratitude. I didn't want a Footlocker, but couldn't bring myself to tell him. We wandered the store looking at switchblades, gas masks, live grenades, then purchased the Footlocker. My dad wanted to get me something else. Realizing a refusal would be unkind, I picked out a denim cowboy shirt with pearl buttons. At the time, a real stretch for me, but in 24 hours, I'd walk away from my past. Style seemed irrelevant. Next door to the Army-Navy sprawled a string of porno shops. Once I snuck into one with a friend. We squeezed into a booth and watched a 25-cent black and white clip, then gaped at magazine jackets, contraptions, and novelties that belonged in a laboratory. A black curtain through which men passed in and out led to a back room. Such experiences, I'm certain, are not unusual among boys, yet standing that day on Liberty Avenue with my father, I was filled not with shame, but regret, because I was leaving, and glad about it. I didn't require absolution, but I longed to tell him about slipping into that dive for all I know, and I realize now how little I know about the inside of my father. He too had been in one of those places before, but it was painful thinking about having something like this in common with my dad. And I valued above all else, and I think he did too, that we never spoke of such things. I was 23 years old, and that fact, and the line of men I issued from, entitled me to my silence. My father and I climbed back into the Chrysler and drove home to my mother, and the last supper we would ever eat together on that still green side of my life. The next morning I picked up I-79 and headed south. In the back seat of my car lay the Foot Locker, which I still own and use to store old manuscripts, notebooks, and letters that in all likelihood I'll never return to. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. I want to say, too, what a beautiful building this is, too. Just really stunning, and it makes a big difference, being in a place like this. I'm going to read a poem called South. The very first day of Vista training, the very first day, seated in the ballroom where the ballroom scene with Gone with the Wind was filmed in Atlanta, Georgia, I met the woman that I ended up marrying. There I was, wine, women, and song, my whole life ahead of me as a swashbuckler. And the very first girl I met, I married, which was the absolute smartest thing I had ever done. But so this was in August, and I came home at Christmas for the first time after being gone on this experience, working in prisons, being in love, being alone. And I always tell my students, if you can ever arrange to be 500 miles away from either set of parents with the person you love, then you should do that. But I came home and I was changed. I really was. Changed in an inner way, but not in an outer way. My whole life's agenda had been rearranged. So this is called South. That first Christmas, after 4 months working a road camp prison north of Charlotte, I caught a ride home to Pittsburgh with a Vista buddy. Before splitting, we attended the camp's AA Christmas party, cookies, carols, drunkalogs leavened with mildness and deference to the season, mainly thankfulness, certain regret, but all about regeneration, how the path through sorrow had yielded its portion of enlightenment. Advent, dark and bitter cold in North Carolina, for anywhere, the first hours of what would prove the fiercest winter in 100 years. When we hit Greensburg, PA, the extent of my lift, I hopped out, still 30 miles off, to thumb the rest of the way. 4:30 in the morning, 11 degrees, among a pack of played-out stiffs on cardboard and rags beneath an overpass bridge, struggling, too, to get somewhere for Christmas. They wore the faces of time. I had learned by then to divine it. Guys no longer astonished by how quickly things go to the bad, who could weather it too. So little to lose. They didn't have to suffer the likes of me. Hitchhiking on the Pennsylvania Turnpike was against the law. I riveted my eyes to the frozen right-of-way and prayed for first light. I rolled into the city in time for breakfast in my parents' kitchen, which sounds like the beginning of things. During the holidays, I played poker, drank a little beer, had final lunches with a couple girls, read George Jackson, Eldridge Cleaver, went to midnight mass with my parents. In my dad's mammoth Newport, I navigated a blizzard to a New Year's Eve party at the Mardi Gras, where a fight jumped off, and a librarian Pinkerton opened a boy's head with his stick, batted to pieces the jukebox, then threw everyone out into the glowing, indifferent ice. of 1977's inaugural morning. I wrote long letters to Joan Carey back with her family in Georgia. People asked how it was living down south. There were a few jokes about prison, but mainly no one wanted to know about it. For the first time, my life belonged to me, and I wanted to keep it secret. Joan and I, in our unheated attic, the candles, standing in line with convicts at the canteen for a cup of chicory, the stink of the overheated cell block, prison cooks and whites frying catfish in the chow hall, flies year-round, the yard snared in blinding concertina, a slick, a backwoods macadam jetting by the cadaverous trailers on Mount Holly, Huntersville Road, where chain gang guards once lived with their families. That winter, as far as the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, it snowed. 500-year-old live oaks crashed to earth. Slow rivers froze. Copperheads furrowed deeper into the quick. And one more from this, which is called Certainty. And all you need to know about this is August of 1976. Joan, not then my wife yet, but I was working pretty hard on it, and figured I was really making a lot of progress. And my Vista boss, a guy named Jim Plumley, we went to a party, and we went in, 9 o'clock at night. We probably got out of there at 3 a.m. And we had come in his Honda. If you remember those early Hondas, they were about as big as a roller skate. And we parked it on the street, came out hours and hours later, and inexplicably, the car was rolling down the street toward us. It remains a mystery, like the Trinity. This is called Certainty. Far from home, penniless, food stamps, everything from Goodwill. I live with Joan Carey, a Baptist girl from Tucker, Georgia. For $80, we leased a Charlotte attic across from Detox and Memorial Stadium, and worked in the prisons. My family in Pittsburgh wondered what I was doing for no wage and why, all the way down in North Carolina like some agitator. The certainty I lived in then made me happier than I've ever been. One torrid August night, 3 a.m., we barged out of a party at the Weavers, Joan and I and Jim, our Vista boss. We had come in Jim's tiny Honda, brown, homely, tires the size of saucers. We were headed for Krispy Kreme up on Independence, the hot donuts now neon, about to announce yet another epiphany in that enchanted tropical August. Joan was 20. Sundresses, I remember, like pets from my childhood. And Jim, so young and confident. Inside, they danced to Thelma Houston's Don't Leave Me This Way, setting fire to Hallelujah, the last sacrifice of summer, hearts and windows shattered across the Queen City. Glad to be together, we stepped into the street toward the car. The night was far from over. Yet up in the huge magnolias, early morning cast its thermal hush upon the revel. The three of us saw it at the same time. Jim's Honda, somehow detached from its station at the curb, rolled down the middle of 8th Street. An automobile, inexplicably animated with sinister purpose, as if we'd tripped unwittingly through the scrim, segregating us from that other world where things happen for no reason at all. Jim and I intercepted it, backpedaling as it bulled us toward the intersection, until we finally halted it inches from catastrophe. We looked at one another and laughed, the way convicts ambling Huntersville Yard laughed about building 30, 40 years in the penitentiary. Guys my age who wouldn't see the streets again until after the sons Joan and I would one day parent had grown into men and left home. The laugh Joan and I exchange all too often when the unimaginable hurtles into an otherwise placid day. The laugh I think of now is fear. And I'll read some poems from the 13th Sunday after Pentecost, which is my most recent book. So I'm going to read a poem called Betsy Wetsy. Some of you all might have had those kinds of dolls. My older sister Marie had one, and I was kind of scandalized by it, a doll that wet itself, And I would kind of kidnap it sometimes and just put it places, And I didn't like it. It was like a Twilight Zone doll to me or something. And not only that, one of its eyes was kind of, had become unmoored, and it just lolled around, you know. So, Betsy Wetsy. Apprenticed to motherhood, Marie made potholders on a wee loom and gave Betsy Wetsy her teeny bottle with real formula that disappeared with each prurient suck of her plastic mouth. Bright red, coquettish, pursed like Betty Boop's, the same black burlesque curls, starlit lashes, looks that spelled trouble, etymology of the word doll. One of her blue eyes was tetched. It lolled open of its own volition. Marie loved her all the more for it. Betsy Wetsy could wet her singular feet, her raison d'etre. What we all waited for, scandalous, a hole out of which pee dribbled, soaking her dotted Swiss. Marie bathed and diapered her. I despised her undressed. Mother washed her clothes with ours. My father built her a cradle. I thought she was one of us, that eye fixed on me. And this one's called The Huckster. In our neighborhood, and I grew up in a now vanished Little Italy called East Liberty, a neighborhood. I never much left the schoolyard as a kid, and I never wanted to. But often people would buy produce from the huckster, which was just a guy with a pickup truck who would travel through the streets, and the women would come out and gather there and buy all this extraordinary produce. But often he would have hot items too. I realize I'm in New Jersey now, so I don't have to tell you what hot means. And if you don't know, ask your great aunt or your grandfather or something. But I do have to, sometimes I have to explain that where I live, because thugs and hoodlums weren't quite as prevalent there as they were in my neighborhood, the huckster. The women on Prince and Omega Streets flocked to let me start again. The women on Prince and Omega Streets flocked to De Domini's field when Cesare, Caesar, the gypsy huckster, arrived in his bright red pickup, spilling gorgeous produce. Flats of begonias and marigolds, cymbidium orchids, lemon ice, elderberries, occasional magnums of Florentine champagne, in its season dressed hair. He looked like Paladin, Caravaggio, with eye hanging on a fender, stealing green grapes, recognized as a cruel face, filthy with stubble, rakish, silent movie mustache, his every move exquisitely choreographed, as if a wizard spinning out of thin air apricots, nectarines, peaches with the complexion of Irish girls, though dressed like an Abruzzi peasant, white kerchief tied at his neck, gold crucifix on his chain, black fedora. He'd knifed Johns on Larmer Avenue over cards and girls. The women in sleeveless summer dresses, fountains of hair scarved at their crowns, change purses. My mother, too, hurried to haggle over the final crop of cherries, damson plums, plowed dripping, bloody in the pan of his scales, its needle jouncing like a Geiger counter. Once he had them in his sway, he revealed his cache of dirt-cheap hot cigarettes, transistor radios, record albums. The silk stockings he withheld until the last, as if he'd conjured them and they possessed the power to turn our mothers into queens. He'd open a package, tear out a flimsy gauntlet, rustle his fist through its mouth and sheath it up his rippling arm. Through its transparent weave, thin black hairs magically sprouted, as if proving his powers, especially over women, that he could make anything happen. Bargains, unimaginable, luxury, transform a huckster's arm into the carnal leg of a beast. Okay, I'm watching this time. Okay, I'm good. This next one is called High Mass. My dad was a steel worker. My mother was a seamstress. All my family came to this country in the first decade of the 20th century from Italy. And my dad was on strike all the time. And when he was on strike, he odd jobbed. He painted houses, he short order cooked, he carried a hod for construction, he did whatever to make money. And so when my dad was home, I loved when my dad was home. It was trouble for my parents, but we were ignorant of the trouble it meant when my father was home. I just loved having my dad home. So this is called High Mass. And one of the things I remember is, we would go to Mass every Sunday, and it would be me and Marie and my mom, and my dad wouldn't be there. So we were kind of out of kilter. So when he was home, we went to High Mass with him. Winter Sundays, when my father was on strike from steel, he and my mother woke late, then rose and prepared for High Mass at St. Peter and Paul. Wandering into the room, I climbed into the 4-poster cherry bed they bought at May Stern the month before marrying in 1947. Warm from their bodies, their scent, its voluminous spread and blankets enveloping me. My mother in a slip at her vanity watched me watch her in its mirror, eyebrows arched, mouth slightly open, tongue dabbing at her upper lip the way women unconsciously arrange their faces when making up. She plucked and painted, brushed forever her long brown hair, circled her mouth with a golden tube of lipstick, and pressed her red lips together in a kiss. Around her neck, fastened pearls, dipped each ear to earring, slipped into her dress and called Joe, my father's name, to zip it. Dark, clean-shaven, he stood at the bureau where they kept insurance policies, immunization records, secret envelopes, choosing a necktie and handkerchief. His white shirt had French cuffs, ruby cufflinks. He smiled at me. That quickly he had her fastened, his red silk tie looped without even looking into a perfect four in hand. My mother, a seamstress, inspected him, then patted his blue suit lapel. She made my sister's clothes. Those mornings, my father in the house, we weren't rushed and resigned. We ate eggs and bacon and rode to church in the Plymouth. Marie and I learned as children never to cross a picket line, and we still won't. Okay. I might have time for 2 more poems. I'm being very careful of the time. Jill and I were talking about how the first poet sometimes reads for 2 hours, and then you have you get up and say hello and you sit down. So I'm going to read a poem called Brooks Brothers Shirts. And I'm reading this for Maria, who I've admired for years and years and years, and this is the first time I've ever laid eyes on her. But she has had legendary status in my psyche all these years. So it's a real thrill to be here. And again, my mother was a seamstress, and she worked in all those high-dollar men's stores in Pittsburgh, one of which was Brooks Brothers. And she was in a room bigger than this, with a few dozen other women who sat behind sewing machines, what we would call a sweatshop. They were in a basement and they sewed. Ironically, they made gorgeous clothing for men who wouldn't give them the time of day. So this is for Maria. This is for my mom, and I'll close with this one because it's a little longer. It should about run out my string here. Brooks, in one of the things I do have time to tell you this too. Because she could get all the clothes at an appreciable discount, I wore exclusively, Brooks Brothers clothes, because, well, and one of the things that was so important to my parents and to immigrant parents and to working class parents and all parents everywhere, I think, is that their kids have more than they had. That was the whole reason why they beat their heads against the wall for years and years, and that's why I'm standing here, with my clean hands, reading these poems, but amazing people, so Brooks Brothers shirts. 10 hours a day, my mother hunched downtown in Brooks Brothers tailor shop, fretting cuffs and belt loops, pleats, vents, buttonholes, lapels into ruthless wool suits, unthinkably expensive for men who spent their days unsoiled, whose soft hands never raised a callus. After she punched out, caught the streetcar and high-heeled home 2 icy downhill blocks from the Callow Hill stop, she often breezed in with packages, icy broadcloth shirts she'd monogrammed with my initials, swathed in smoky, silvery tissue, the deep navy boxes piped in gold, the gold band that bound them, and in their centers the Brooks Brothers coat of arms, a golden ewe lowered on a sling into a sacrificial grail, the Agnus Dei. My mother dressed me like a prince. Apparel doth proclaim the man I'd one day read in Hamlet. Those luscious shirts, the forbidden glory of plenty, of too much really. They privileged me among my parents' oppressors, every day with neckties, blazers, oxblood, penny loafers, Princeton wave that swooped my yearning brow. I wore them to school, blue, pink, yellow, charcoal, and burgundy pinstripe, tattersall, blinding, ecclesiastical white. I wore them to church. I adored those shirts, my immaculate patrician destiny. My mother washed them by hand, hung to dry in the winter sun, spritzed with water from an Iron City pony, then shelved them in plastic bags overnight in the freezer. She loved them just as much as I did. My father, a steel worker, a crane climber, he loved them too. He didn't want me to get my hands dirty. He wanted me to work for myself. My mother ironed in the cellar where my father shaved out of an enamel basin with hot water from the wash tub. A small mirror on a nail pounded into the block wall he whitewashed every year. On his workbench, he stationed a sleeve board for the long tedium of the crease, true as a plumb line, dabs of starch at collar and cuff, shots of steam from the iron's black button, mother's needle hand steering the hissing wedge just shy of scorching the frozen fabric, which is the charm. My shirts were sharp enough to bring blood. Monday through Friday, school, then Sunday, high mass, the shirts awaited me dangling on hangers from the cellar's copper ceiling pipes, 6 of them in a skirmish, nudging one another in the darkness, complicit in my certain future, swaying slightly like a slow dance in the heat vent's tepid whisper, at their throats the oval writ, Brooks Brothers, makers, established 1818. Thank you.